Well, welcome to the Music Academy of the West. I'm John Steiner. I'm the CFO here at the Music Academy of the West. So I'm excited to introduce our panelists today because, money and finance are near and dear to my heart. So just a couple of things here. So welcome to our audience. This is the first ever Classical Revolution Revolution Conference here at the Music Academy of the West. And our panel today here is very important to anybody's career, especially as it relates to money and finance. And this is a topic that we're excited to talk about. To my immediate left here, our moderator, Phillippa, and she is joined by panelists Kevin Erickson and Corey Fields. So welcome. Glad to have you. I'd also like to welcome our live streamers. So we're live streaming this event. The earlier session that we had today, we had over 500 people live streaming in. So very impactful and we want to welcome those that are joining us via the website. So thank you to our panelists, and we'll look forward to hearing more from you.
Thank you very much, John. Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back. Hope you had a good lunch. The main object of our discussion in this session is to look at how performers today make money. Without doubt, the last few decades have certainly seen a dramatic change in how musicians can be recognized. And I'd suggest that for the majority of classical musicians starting off in the business today, that live performance naturally continues to be their central wish and focal point. After all, they didn't spend hours in a practice room for nothing. It is inevitable that elements such as teaching and session work are becoming increasingly more and more important for musicians to a greater or lesser degree. We'll take some time in this session to look at the supplementary ways that musicians today can make money. My own feeling and my own experience in this is that live performance has to remain at the very core of a successful artist's career. Sure, there are important ways to reach audiences, both established and new audiences, via social media, via recordings, downloading, streaming, and today's musicians are having to be open to the idea that the scope of their work may need to broaden in order to reach out and meet the demands of both audiences and promoters alike. Community outreach programs, education programs, meeting and greeting with sponsors are all very much part of today's normal practice and are often included as part of a contract. But at the end of the day, when you can't deliver on the stage, the rest will fall away rather quickly. Quality is the key. To me, it follows logically that income follows this model. The lion's share of income to a successful classical musician is in live performance, much more so than, say, in the pop business, where traditionally record sales have been a bigger piece of the revenue. So as long as classical musicians continue to entertain at the highest level, I believe this will remain the case. Now, of course, there are synergies. An artist can build a stronger brand via recordings and online activity, and that can also increase their worth on the stage by commanding a higher fee, attracting a larger audience. People like Joyce DiDonato and Yannick Nezet-Sagan and Lang Lang Adudamel are surely good examples of this. And there are ancillary markets, too, in the areas of sponsorship and endorsements. But in my experience, these are so very few opportunities. We're a tiny percentage of the world of classical music. And even the greatest musicians do not have people knocking on their doors, asking them for endorsements. It is worth remembering, though, that our industry is less fickle than some others. It's difficult to reach the standards required. And it takes time to be an inquisitive audience member. And it's far less based on looks and fashions than in other areas of performing arts. And the good news is that classical music, we do have a long shelf life. As long as the quality is consistent, there is no reason why we can't go on for many, many years. We admire our elderly musicians, and we support them as long as they can deliver. So in a lot of cases, income can accrue much later into life. Perhaps there's no need to rush. I think it's also worth noting that the appetite for live performance has not diminished, arguably quite the opposite in this world when we crave the moment away from a busy day, away from the screen, away from an email. The concert hall is perhaps the temple of the 21st century. Sure, we lose audiences. We were talking earlier about losing people in their 40s and 50s. And we lose people when they're busy working, when they're busy bringing up children. But we can regain them again. And, you know, arguably they have a more disposable income to concerts later on in life. So certainly in my experience, performance lies at the heart of a classical musician's career and must continue that way for the money to follow suit. Now, I'm joined today by two of my colleagues, Corey here and Kevin, both of whom have great experience. Corey started his life as a composition student, a degree he described yesterday as completely useless. And
I got a lot of pushback on that.
He got a lot of pushback.
From someone with a degree in Romance languages, it turned out.
And he then went into the music publishing business, and now he still earns a career, earns his income in the music business as an entertainment lawyer. Corey, actually, maybe you should start off. How did you earn a living when you were a composition student and then going into the big wide world? And do you think it changes if you were starting again now?
Well, thank you, and I first want to say thank you to everyone who organized this, the Music Academy of the West and their staff, the 21C Media and Jessica Lustig. The fact that we're even sitting here in a building where this was just the dining room talking about classical music shows you the incredible level of commitment that's necessary to even have an event like this. And it also is kind of a reminder of something you mentioned, which I think is one of the more useful points that we just can't forget. This really is a niche. It's a beautiful, wonderful, essential, life-affirming, can't live without it niche, and it always has been. Even in the era of Mozart and Beethoven, if you remember, their patrons were the aristocracy. That was a niche, and thank God that they were there to help fund the great works that we love so much today. So part of the long-term, I think, reality, and I can only offer my own experiences. I can't, speak for anybody else. But, for example, as a very untalented composer who fortunately became a music publisher in classical, contemporary classical music, and then an attorney, I've always been involved in the niche. I mean, when we talk about performers and fees that might be paid, and you mentioned a couple well-known performers, that actually seems like a lucrative career option compared to a modern composer. So for 30, 40 years, I've been dealing with people who are the niche of the niche. And what I'm pleased to see overall is that people find a way. When it's the arts, either marry well, have a day job, all the usual things that might help you keep going if you can't earn a living. Okay? I'm glad you're laughing. But you're laughing because it's true. Yeah. Okay. Day job. I was the recipient of a wife with a day job when I was a composition student. And so my personal experience was, I made a little list here. So I got some commission fees. I was a journalist. I've been a concert reviewer and a writer and got paid a little bit for that. I taught elementary music school in the Goleta Union School District at 3 schools. I did that. I got grants. I got prizes and awards. And then, interesting for a musician, when my then wife and we had a baby and I needed a job, and I went to New York and I got a job in the international classical music publishing industry, and I did that for many years. And the only other income I had then was I still was a journalist and a writer. And then I had the crazy idea, I went to law school, and so now I'm an entertainment copyright trademark lawyer, and I do have, obviously, a niche in classical music. I represent the Philadelphia Orchestra, I represent lots of Pulitzer Prize-winning composers, and all kinds of fun projects in that very, very, very small legal niche as well. And I'm still a writer and I teach. So yeah, putting it together has been my own experience. I don't know if that's useful for you, but that's, and my observation from my clients, and then we'll turn it over to Kevin, is that they come to me when they have an important life, legal, and economic event. If it's a composer, then it's the publishing agreement that will literally determine who publishes them the rest of their lives. If it's a performer, it's a recording agreement. In this day and age, I have clients who are very involved in new media, who are influencers, and we'll talk about that as a new income stream. So, you know, there's really a, beyond the peak of the pyramid, I like to call it, of people who get lucrative fees for live performance. Everyone else is at the next few steps of the pyramid down. And speaking of pyramid-shaped objects, I did want to point out the logo for the conference is a volcano. And I think this is actually a good metaphor, because volcanoes destroy, then they create. And that's what's been going on in the classical music business and money side for quite a while now. All of the new media and all the new technology has been destroying a lot of the old expectations. Even in pop music, you don't go around expecting to get a lucrative record deal anymore, okay? That's been destroyed. But volcanoes also create new land. As you know, in Hawaii, there's actually new parts of the island created by lava that cooled. So now you have something new to build on, and that's the case here as well. So as just an initial comment and background, I will turn it over to Kevin.
Thank you very much, Corey. Kevin, you work for the Future Music Coalition. I know that they've done a number of case studies and done a lot of research on how musicians make an income and all the different streams. Will you tell us a bit about that and also the work that the FMC is doing in general?
Sure, yeah. I feel really privileged to be here. Thank you so much. Future Music Coalition was founded about 16 years ago in Washington, D.C. It's a nonprofit that does education, research, and advocacy for musicians, ideally for the entire diversity of the music community. And we got into the research part of the work that we did for a couple of reasons. One, because it helps artists as they're navigating these complexities, and there's a lot of complexity when you try to understand how the money gets from point A to point B from the box office or from the fans into the artist or composer's pocket. So it's partially about navigating that, but it's also about informing the policy discussions, because it's impossible to make policy change without data to back up your claims and arguments. I think it should be uncontroversial to say that most popular media accounts of how musicians make a living can kind of miss the mark or don't ring true. They don't necessarily account for this kind of complexity. Most statistics that you hear come from press releases rather than research. Most analysis is designed to help one corporation or another make money. And in the absence of data about how musicians make a living, we're left with sort of anecdotes and warring anecdotes. And anecdotes can calcify as conventional wisdom and as pervasive industry myths, like there's mountains of money that you can easily acquire from YouTube if you just get enough views somehow, or that crowdfunding has fixed everything, all of the revenue problems have fallen away. For folks in the classical space, I think the general accounts that we often hear feel even more off of the mark, because for a variety of reasons, classical is often invisible from discussions about the broader industry. One of the reasons is that there's this historic bifurcation between the commercial and the nonprofit sector, and so the associated infrastructure with each wing of music might not always mix, and that's particularly true with the data that's generated on each side of that. The commercial folks have their own institutions, and the nonprofit commercial folks serving the classical and jazz communities principally have their own data sets. And so, for example, companies that track things like live music attendance and revenue for the broader commercial music industry may not even count what's going on at the Symphony Hall. So there's a self-perpetuating dynamic. The big institutions don't serve the classical folks, and so the classical folks build their own thing over here, and so the segregation continues as well. So one of the things that means is to find out how musicians are making a living, we have to ask them, and preferably lots of them, and lots of different kinds of musicians. So Future of Music undertook this big research project a few years ago. We called it the Artist Revenue Streams Project, and our principal research question was, what percentage of musicians' income comes from each possible revenue source? What's the ratio among different sources, whether it's royalties, live performance, t-shirt sales, whatever? Is it changing over time? And are the revenue stream ratios different from artists working in different genres and at different stages of their careers? We talked to a lot of people. We talked to a lot of different kinds of people. We did a web-based survey with about 5,300 musicians. We went into greater depth with 81 people, getting some real qualitative information from them about how they structured their careers. And then we went into depth, going over very detailed year-by-year financial records with 6 individuals representing different parts of the music ecosystem. Talked to a whole broad range of different folks. We ultimately found, we also gathered a bunch of additional data points, so we were able to break down the data that we collected by a bunch of different variables, demographics, the role that they played in the industry, whether they're principally a performer, principally a composer, or a sideman, or what different kinds of hats that they might be wearing. We ultimately found that there are 42 different revenue streams. That's a lot. We've actually found a few more since then. We're up to like 45. The point is, and I'm not going to go through all of these. I'll encourage you to check out the full reports on our website. But the point is not that any individual musician should attempt to reap revenue from every one of these. That would be crazy and hard. But to try and capture the full diversity of activity that's going on. Now, this data is a few years old. A lot can change in a few years, especially in a field as volatile as music. We'd love to replicate this study. So if you know anybody who has a lot of money that you want to give us so we can do that, let me know. But one of the, so if you've got all of these different kinds of revenue streams, let's see, these are the streams that you're participating in. As you can imagine, it doesn't get divided evenly between all of the different sources. As you mentioned, it looks different for different kinds of artists. So for this particular artist, live performance is really core, and then they have a salaried position as well, and then it breaks down further after that. There's different things that are sort of the bread and butter, and then other kinds of income that accumulate together, and that all gathers into how one makes a living. And there are differences by genre. When we talked about the traditional revenues being disrupted, what's traditional depends on what kind of music that you're making. So you can see here we've laid out jazz, classical, rock, country. Classical's got some things that are unique about it. That light blue portion there represents the portion of income that's coming from a salaried, and I think that reflects the practices of symphony orchestras hiring salaried players, something that you don't see in other genres in a similar way on a similar scale. But for other genres, there are things like rock musicians are able to make more from merchandise sales, from T-shirts and that kind of thing than folks in other genres. That all makes sense, but it's nice to have some real data to back up those kinds of things. One of the things that's unique about classical is that classical musicians tend to actually wear fewer main hats, occupy fewer sort of overall roles. They tend to be more focused, less multitasking. I think that represents, among other things, the amount of unique focus, performance focus. I think some of the things that you're talking about and how much of the overall effort and energy and creative drive that central craft occupies. Classical folks tend to earn a little bit more than folks in other genres. I think there are also associated educational costs that number doesn't necessarily reflect. But one of the things that we learn, I guess, is that, well, I'll just say, here's a band leader who had said, if I'd stayed in Los Angeles, I'd be making much more money. I'd be unhappy because I'd be playing more industrial music and less music that I have an actual interest in and passion for. The reason that I wanted to share this with you is because I think we'll talk more about this too, is that there is the roles that you occupy and the choices that you make about what role you occupy, and the ways, the things that you consider to be central to your creative practice, and what you find rewarding, and what you're willing to risk, and what you're willing to give up. Part of the practice, part of creating a career for yourself, creating a creative life for yourself, is constantly asking yourself those questions. And the answer that you start with, the assumptions about where you're going to end up, might not be where things look a little further down the road. So it's important to keep an open mind as you're moving through different phases of your career. So I have a couple of case studies, and I've shared hard copies of a couple of case studies with you folks, but I just want to highlight a couple of data points from them. We have a case study of a salaried symphony player, and let's see. So this case study tracks a performer from his time in grad school to playing in multiple local symphonies, and then gigging while auditioning for major orchestras, and then eventually landing a job with a major orchestra. It's like they won the lottery. It's like getting a tenured position at a university. It's very competitive. As you can see, that salary ends up being really primary to unsurprisingly, really primary to what it means to make a living. And if you look over the full 10 years of data, you can see there's a couple things that jump out here. So first of all, let me just make sure you understand this chart. So above this line here is revenue, and below the line are the associated expenses. And this is just music-related income on this chart. There may be other kinds of day jobs and things, and we're not measuring that in this context. But one of the things is that makes this kind of a career path unique is the relationship between revenue and expenses. By the time this player is able to score that prime job with the symphony, a whole lot more, there's a whole lot less expenses. There are a couple of sunk costs, obviously the cost of the instrument, which is much more substantial for classical genres typically than other genres of music, and the educational cost. But at that point, the relationship between revenue and expenses is much more of a net positive. If we look at another case study, this is a chamber ensemble. And there's a detailed breakdown of the year-by-year revenues for this ensemble in the case study, and you can take a look at that. But one of the things that this case study indicates to me is how crucial having a good team can be, how much relationships and networking, in a good way, not in an opportunistic way, with presenting organizations, et cetera, can impact your career arc. Live performance is very crucial for this ensemble. Now one of the things about this particular case study is it's just mapping income for the ensemble. So in the early years of this chamber group back in 2002, the members may have been doing day jobs or teaching and that kind of thing outside of their music-related income. But when things take off for them, they hire a manager in 2004, and that manager opens up a whole lot of doors for them and new performance opportunities. And at that point, they're going to have to quit those day jobs. But there's rewards associated with it as well, in terms of the pickup in activity that they're generating as a result. Another thing that's interesting about this is that during this time, the ensemble's recording for a pretty prominent independent record label. They recorded a number of albums, but there's not a lot of royalties reflected here. In fact, direct CD sales at their shows outpace the royalty checks that they're getting. And that is actually sort of normal when you're doing really quite small numbers in this very niche genre. It doesn't mean that they got a bad record deal or anything like that, but just that the recorded music marketplace functions differently in the classical space than it does in the rest of the world. Sometimes we hear people say, well, if the recorded music economy totally craters, then people can just make it up on the road. And I think it's important to push back on that, even in classical, to understand that it's important for commercial partners to have an incentive to continue to invest in the making of those recordings, because even if they're not making money directly from those recordings, as you talked about, there's a synergy thing that happens in terms of the increased profile, what it does for the relationships with the promoters and that kind of thing. Oh, here's a jazz musician. He's somebody who navigates a bunch of multiple roles, and I highlighted this one because, so I want to point out that, let's see, moving through a lot of different roles, and the income makeup is very different from year to year. That can be totally, if that's something you're comfortable with, that can be something that's workable. But in 2010, grants made up 35% of his gross income, and look at that increase in the overall income. It's super exciting, except that when you actually break down the grants, a lot of it went right out the door. In fact, the artist only took home 1% of that grant. So it's important to think about, even grants from places like Chamber Music America or New Music USA are frequently really project grants, and so there's potentially restricted funding, which almost always has expenses attached to it. So even grants where the artist's budgets take-home pay for themselves, often as a leader of a project, they end up subsidizing projects that they lead heavily. Let's see, there's more case studies and things on our website, and I would encourage you to check it out. There's a case study of an indie rock musician who spent 5 years, we have 5 years of economic data, and he was a salaried member of a group, and then used the salary that he was pulling from that group to fund his solo career before ultimately leaving that group once his solo stuff became sustainable. And I think that's an important conversation. We can talk more about that too, but sometimes the stuff that's most important to your identity as an artist, your sense of what your practice is about, is not the stuff that pays the bills, or sometimes having something that can pay the bills can get you to a place where you can focus on that piece of the puzzle. And again, it's just important to not get yourself into a narrative where there's one vision of the future, and if that vision doesn't manifest itself, you feel like you've failed. I think we'll all have more to say about that. The other thing that I want to mention is that we have this cool data portal where you can directly access our full survey results, and it's at arsdata.futureofmusic.org. And you can pull in different variables and see how your career path compares to other folks have done historically, or see how things vary based on genre, based on location, based on things like union membership even. It's really robust, and it's a lot of fun to play around with, so you can check that out. Cool.
Thank you very much, Kevin. That's great. Corey, I wanted to chat to you actually just taking up on a point that Kevin was talking about recordings and streaming. We're definitely in a digital age. We're a global market, global opportunities. We are in a situation where you can see a chamber music concert being streamed from Germany, and when you're in Brazil, and if you can't get to the Berlin Philharmonic Orchestra on a Saturday night, it doesn't matter because they'll come to your own home via the television. So who is getting the benefit of that?
Well, this is the era when, as actually was mentioned in the first panel today, you can be in charge of your own destiny. Again, the volcano metaphor. Some things are destroyed and some things are created. So let's say traditional record sales are down, and now there's more streaming and other ways to get recorded music. Well, you actually, in today's world, you could be your own record label. It's quite common. You could make yourself a presence on YouTube. You could make as you sort of inferred, make your performances available to the entire world immediately. You also have the opportunity to get into the patronage game with Kickstarter. You can raise money for your next concert or your album. There's just social media. I actually was on the phone today. Some of my clients are what are called today influencers. And much of the advertising world is going that way. And if someone can parlay their classical music performance, their musician personality, especially with videos, there is actually income to be made as someone who endorses products, which is also a fairly common way for people to have a side level of income. There's the curation, which is huge today. One of my clients is the Sundance Film Festival, and they curate. They, every year, assemble a festival of what they recommend as the best in films, and it's one of the world's great cultural events. So there's something to be said for someone establishing themselves as a curator. Now, the question is not so much what is the endless variety of things you can do with today's technology, but I think you said something about how do you get paid for that. Yeah. Okay, so there's, I can be a resource for you to tell you how to get paid. The problem is always going to be that you're going to need 50 million views of your video. You're going to need 10 million streams of your recording on Pandora or Spotify, because we live in this vast world where we now know what the numbers are. So, I mean, to make it really simple, okay, can you make money on YouTube? Very simple answer, yes. They will put ads next to your video, and if enough people watch your video, they'll split the ad revenue with you. Couldn't be simpler. Everybody gets that. The problem is that unless it's millions of views, it won't add up to anything. And we're not even going down the rabbit hole of rights, like, can you do that? Is it a piece that Phillippa composed? Is it okay if you use her piece in your video? So that's the subject of another panel, probably just for lawyers. So then on the new normal in recordings, streaming, Pandora, the rates, politics are a big story these days. I don't know how many of you realize how much of the music industry is regulated by the United States government. To people who know the industry, that's like, yeah, I get that. To other people, it's like, what? We're regulated like toxic nuclear waste? Well, we are, okay? The government, the Department of Justice, is a big, huge building in Washington, D.C. with hundreds of lawyers. And guess what? One of their concerns is the public performance of music. In the music industry, this is a well-known phenomenon. To the average person, it's like, what? The Department of Justice is involved when someone plays the Alban Berg, pick your piece on the radio? Seriously? Yeah, they are, believe it or not. So, part of the economic reality is that for things like public performances, let's say you're a musician, if you're a recording artist, that means someone who sings or plays, and you have made a recording, obviously you can sell the copies of the recording, and great if you can. We heard this morning from Ann Midget that a lot of smaller labels are only actually even making CDs for people who need to remember which CD they've reviewed, which is 13 people in the country at the moment. But most of this stuff is streamed, and the government sets the rate for that revenue. On Pandora, every time a recording is streamed, 3 judges in the Copyright Office in Washington, D.C. actually decided what the value of that performance is, and it's 0.00011 cents per stream, okay?
So can I just interrupt you? Do they encourage...
Please interrupt me. Rule of thumb here, stop me when I keep going too far.
Do streaming models, if they produce such a little revenue for artists, do they encourage them to participate, or is it simply just an exercise in building a bigger brand, getting your music out there, if it doesn't make any sense to them financially? Is that what you're saying?
To the artist?
Yeah.
Well, this has always been the problem for people in the arts. Where's the trade-off between what's good for your career and you do for free and making money? This has never changed, okay? I'll just do this one more free concert because the director of the New York Philharmonic will be in the audience. That is how the arts work, okay? So that is nothing new, and the fact that now we're making that devil's choice for 18 cents of streaming royalties, to me, is just a different way we're making that choice. So I'm not sure there's an alternative. I'm not sure there's an end game that anyone could promise. I mean, my role in this panel today is to the extent I can coherently, tell you what the economic reality is in recordings and performance and the union stuff and all that, sort of like another take on Kevin's presentation. I don't think there is a choice. I think there's no question if you're an artist, you need to have your recordings out there. The great news is you can do it yourself if you really want to. It's not that expensive in today's world, and you can actually, there's companies like CD Baby, you send them a decent recording, and the next thing you know, it's on Pandora, it's on Spotify, it's on YouTube, it's on iTunes for download, and you're not going to make much money, but you almost have to do it. The people who I think are making the most traction have a different vision, okay? Lindsey Stirling, anybody know who she is? She's a dancing, violin playing, composing, video making, quadruple threat. And I always talk about her as the great example of the era of YouTube, because she was like a YouTube Artist of the Year. She does get the millions of views. She did have the endgame result, which I think your question is kind of about the endgame result, which is now there's a Lindsey Stirling billboard on the Sunset Strip advertising her touring and her recording. And so I think, endgame, if you can find a way into that world, there is an endgame. I think you'll hear tomorrow, you're going to have representatives of record labels, but from everything I ever hear is that they're very keen to know how many Facebook followers and YouTube views an artist has had as they're considering that among the aspects of whether this is someone who's commercially viable. We have this amazing lab out there right now. It's called social media. And if you have millions of followers, you might find that you have more opportunities in the traditional media, like record labels, like even concert bookings. So I think this whole question of how much money is there now, what's the end game, I guess my message is you have to participate in that globally. I think you have more chance of success if you're flexible and you are willing to become something like a video star on YouTube, if possible. And there is, I think, an end game then. I think then you might get concert bookings, then maybe you will get that mythical recording agreement that actually makes you some money, which in the classical world is unusual, but you'll hear more about that tomorrow.
I think it's also important to differentiate, like streaming is a big category, and there's multiple kinds of streaming and multiple kinds of business models, and I hope there will be more. I hope there'll be more experimentation in that space, and more, there was, what was it, Prime Phonic that just came online in the past couple of weeks, which is a classical specific streaming service, which alters the payout model in potentially positive ways, because it's less about, my understanding is, I may be wrong about this, but my understanding is that it's less about using the track count as the proxy, play count as the proxy for value, and more about like actually the duration of listening, which corrects a thing that on other competing services like Spotify, it tends to disadvantage classical music as a result of the way the payout model works. So there can be encouraging developments, but there's also a difference between the legal regime and the amount of flexibility that artists have around their choices on interactive streaming versus non-interactive streaming. Services like Spotify are not the same as services like SiriusXM or the traditional radio model of Pandora. And so it is actually pretty important to get into those granular details and think about what makes the most sense for you. I think that disintermediation can be helpful. I think that a lot of artists working in new music find Bandcamp to be a really great resource, for example. So streaming is just a delivery mechanism. What the debates about streaming are really about are business models. And I think streaming won't go away, but some of these business models might go away. They might not ultimately be sustainable even for those companies. But it is likely there's going to be more experimentation and new things being tried.
Just on the streaming, I find it interesting. Certainly, the artists that I represent today, they would still much prefer to be with a record label than actually be in charge of their own destiny. we were talking about earlier, you can create your own album and you can be the distributor of that, and you can be your artistic controller, your own artistic director. But still, I think there's a huge kudos to be said if you're signed up with Deutsche Grammophon or Universal or Warner, whoever it might be. Just the sort of prestige of that, I think that has never gone away in classical music. And though we're told every day that the record industry is either dead or dying, but still that there's that popularity there, and everything that comes with being on, with being with one of those big labels, I think is still really relevant.
And you might be in a position to like let somebody who's already an expert on promotion and marketing do your promotion and marketing and let yourself focus on being an artist.
Yeah, I think we're looking at, again, I mentioned the peak of the pyramid before. I'm always mindful of the people at the top of the pyramid have always been and always will be taken good care of. It's going to be fine for the very, very small number of truly international stellar artists. There will be money. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also, funnily enough, at the other end, in my experience, the very top of that pyramid are indeed well looked after, and the bottom of the pyramid, the youngsters coming up, the slightly cheaper artists, if I may say that, they are also finding themselves a niche. They're also younger, they're more flexible, they're happier to go into areas that perhaps, they didn't train to do for so long. But it's when the times are tough financially, I find that it's the middle range artists, the people who are established, who have a sort of fee tag connected to them, but are not people who, for want of a better phrase, put bums on seats. And they are the people who suffer, I find, in today's world a little bit.
Well, my own observation is that in that middle tier, which is very important to include in the conversation, because it's no use for me to go up here and tell you about the fabulous new media and social media opportunities for, a famous artist. I mean, that just doesn't apply to other people. The middle tier is very interesting to talk about, and is where sometimes we feel we can be the most useful. So, one of the questions, two things, again, to broaden the conversation a little bit, is I mentioned in my opening comments the very long history of what I guess the word is patronage. It's Count Razumovsky, whose name we know because he paid for a couple Beethoven works. How great is that? Talk about value for money. Man, I'd love to know how many groschen he paid to be world famous till the end of time. Pretty good deal for him, actually. And in today's world, it's called a nonprofit, and it's called an arts organization. And so one of the things I would advise anybody who is in the classical space is to acknowledge that you are part of a vast nonprofit business model, okay? Are there any for-profit performing organizations at all? I know the record labels are, but who's a one? Who is that? Well, God bless them, whoever they are. I'm a little worried we never heard of them, but I like the concept. So my point is that if you're an artist, you have to find a way maybe to get into that system, that they do wonderful things. This organization does wonderful things, and I'm pretty sure as a nonprofit that does fundraising, they all do. It's the way it works. The New York Philharmonic, the Metropolitan Opera, it is the live performance model. And I think it behooves anybody who wants to get into the industry and get the advantage of that support to be familiar with those organizations, to understand how they work, that's the patronage today. And what always impresses me is that there's so many people who love music, are incredibly dedicated, and literally spend their lives to making these nonprofit arts organizations work, present things, support the arts. So at some level, somewhere in there is just the reality of, on the one hand, being in charge of your destiny, knowing social media, using it, and on the other hand, finding some way to be part of this new world of nonprofit, quote, patronage. And patronage, by the way, just to make it clear, is meant to be a very positive, good word in the context of the arts, not a bad word.
We've talked a bit about soloists and the people at the top of the pyramid in terms of making money. I'm interested to talk a bit more about orchestral musicians. I know a lot of the students here, our fellows here, are training to be orchestral musicians. A lot of the orchestras in this country, particularly, are controlled by the unions, Corey. Is that a benefit for musicians in making money? Is that a hindrance? Is it a help? Has it got worse over the last few years?
So we're on Facebook Live, and the unions are probably watching me. I should be careful what I say. The unions in the entertainment industry are a major, important force. They exist like they exist for the same reason in all other industries, in order to help people earn a living wage. So as a fundamental proposition for musicians, the AFM is a good thing, because if you're in the AFM and you're in an organization that's paying the AFM mandated rates, you will probably have something resembling a living wage, or maybe even a little better than that. So that's a good thing. The reality in the entertainment industry, including music, is that that reality of protecting the wages of workers has caused the production side to look elsewhere. And I'm just telling you facts. It's not even my opinion. In the film industry, it's called Runaway Production, and it has resulted in many film production companies leaving the traditional centers like Los Angeles and New York to go elsewhere, driven by two factors. One is potentially lower union costs, whether it's AFM or other unions, and tax subsidies in other states. There's a system out there now where, you may not be aware of this, it's mostly in the film and television industry, but a state like Georgia, a state like Louisiana, invites companies to come film their shows there. And not only do they say, we don't have the usual unions, or our unions are less expensive, which is an incentive for them, they also say that we'll give you a refund on your state taxes and other types of benefits. So I'd have to say that the reality, not actually taking a side either way, is very twofold. Unions are a great thing to protect their members financially, but they have also resulted, as a fact, not my opinion, in producers and owners looking to get away from those protections. So we have kind of a two-sided beast right now, but that is the reality. And I deal in union matters for some of my bigger arts clients.
I think that, first of all, we have, as part of our research project, we do have a data memo that talks about organizational membership and its impact on earnings, and it did find that union membership did result in higher income, and you can check that out at the money.futureofmusic.org website. I think that more broadly, the role of the unions, historically, one of the important roles that they've played is as a vehicle for collective action. And when we talk about how musicians make a living, there's a tendency to frame it all in very individualistic terms. There's good reasons for that sometimes. Every musician's a unique individual with unique needs and unique goals, and they bring unique skills to the table. Where it can become problematic, though, is that when we talk about it just as acquisition of career skills and entrepreneurialism and gaining a competitive advantage over others in the field, some of the most profoundly impactful things that we can do are things that benefit everybody in the field and not just individual musicians, or not just individual actions, but collective actions. And so I think that part of what it means to learn how to make a living as a musician is also learning how to be an advocate and even an activist for music, for musicians' rights, for musicians' livelihoods collectively. That's a lifelong skill. Unions are one of the important vehicles where that work has historically been done. It's not the only one. And right now, there are a number of relatively urgent fronts where collective action is needed. So I would encourage everybody to try and make that an ongoing part of your practice as a musician or as a patron. We need to defend the National Endowment of the Arts in public broadcasting. We need to defend net neutrality, which is the principle that the internet works the same for everybody, that the pipes don't disadvantage small nonprofit presenting organizations in favor of large media corporations. And perhaps most urgently, because it's really happening in the next couple of weeks, we really really need your help defending the Affordable Care Act against congressional attempts to repeal it. Our research found that before the Affordable Care Act passed, musicians lacked health insurance at nearly 3 times the rate of the general population. This is a core economic issue for musicians. That's a core part of like what it means to put together a life as a working musician. My point, I guess, is that these questions are just as central to, whether it's through union membership or some other vehicle. These questions are just as central to like how you make a living as all the entrepreneurship stuff. I would love to see a future where every conservatory that's teaching an entrepreneurship class is also teaching a class on collective action.
Thank you very much, Kevin. One thing we haven't talked about, we've talked about some supplementary ways that musicians can increase their income through the normal, I suppose, practices, teaching and film session work and that kind of thing. But what we haven't talked about...
And working at Starbucks. Don't forget working at Starbucks.
And working at Starbucks. But there are actually, all 3 of us here are classic examples of it, I think, and also many more of my colleagues on the panels. A lot of us are performing musicians in our backgrounds. I mean, hundreds of years ago, we played instruments and we studied at music school and that kind of thing. There is, certainly in the UK, I don't know if it's the same over here, but there is a great reluctance, I guess, to talk about those fields that perhaps some people may go into, rightly because they want to or because they have to. To be a music journalist, to be a critic, to be an agent, to be a publisher, whatever it is we all do. That's very relevant. And I think certainly in my case, my artists appreciate the fact that I have a background in music, and it does enable, I think, an understanding between a manager and an artist. If you are on, if you have empathy for what they're doing. I don't know if this is something that is brought up in grad schools today, and whether it's it's a taboo subject. I mean, nobody wants to hear when they go to Juilliard that maybe it won't work out for them, and maybe they should think about doing something else already. And I don't want to be the person who tells them that, but I think it is useful to be part of a curricula. Would you agree, Corey?
Yeah, it is part of the curriculum in the States. There's many universities that have a music business degree. It is a way to earn a living and still be connected to music. I won't say I invented it, but I did that. I was a musician who wound up working in the publishing business, which for me turned out to be life-changing because the connection between the arts and business is kind of an exciting place to be. And that place is filled with musicians. As a matter of fact, I'm not sure how many people I ever run into who weren't musicians in some way, shape, or form in that industry. What we're taking the conversation now to sort of a dark place. If any of you are actually like Music Academy of the West students, how many actual musicians do we have here? Okay, I don't want you guys listening to the next 3 minutes. Just don't even listen, okay? So here's the deal, is that not everybody makes it as one of these statistics making a living, okay? Maybe you do for a while and you drop out. One of the horrific things that has hit the classical music world is the sort of fashionista thing. When I started out, it was still the good, solid Nazi refugees in tuxedos who represented the music industry. And now, if you go to any like Chamber Music America conference, and they've got all the managers with the photos of their artists, it's a glamour puss festival. It's amazing. And so almost by definition, if you have booked this year's glamour puss beautiful performers, 5 years from now, you're going to book the next ones. So careers, may have a shorter life because of just kind of the way society is looking at, who's a musician and how appealing they are and why we're going to book them. So if that's the case, I mean, first of all, there are degrees in music business administration. I'm not so sure, how great that is either, by the way, because, when I first went to New York looking for a job, RCA Records had like 30 to 50 employees doing just classical. They had a classical music department with dozens of people. That doesn't exist anymore. So, where you fit into the industry now, of course, what would you do? You'd get a job at Google. Of course you would. Tech is it. They really are. So, those are all the realities. One thing I wanted to say about your excellent remarks about the realities of like health insurance, because one thing about the statistics is I don't think you actually tell us how much people are making, right? It's like what percentage is music, or do you?
There are some data points in the broader survey where we get into like the actual
numbers,
the actual revenue. But in the case studies, we did eliminate that access for privacy reasons.
Right,
Yes.
of course, and as well done. But the reality is that health insurance costs money. Okay, and one of the giving back things I do is the Grammy organization. You all know what the Grammys are. They have a wonderful charity called Music Cares. And it raises money every year, and it gives grants to musicians who need help. And I happen to be on the committee who approves every single one of those grants as a charitable contribution to the world. And musicians who just can't figure out the economics of being a musician often wind up, there's no work coming in. I needed a tooth removed. I had a heart attack, whatever, and they've got no money, and thank God for Music Cares giving them those funds. But that is a scary, dark place to get to for someone who loves music and might even be a great talent. That's a horrible place to get to. So the question then becomes, is there some other way to love music, to participate, and not be on that list of destitute musicians? And so I think it's a great topic. We have 2 solutions here. Are you a musician? I forgot. Yeah, okay, 3. We've got 3
My
solutions
core
here.
creative practice is recording and
Okay.
producing. But
Close enough.
I play
In
on
today's
people's
world,
records.
that's a musician. You're good. And so, yeah, I think it's something worth discussing. There is some training specifically for that. I don't happen to know if at the leading conservatories they also have a just in case day job seminar or something like that. No idea.
Well, yeah, I mean, first of all, Music Cares is an incredible organization, does incredible work. Also, we need single payer, and we just need it. I think that like my own path, like part of it is about making choices about what you're interested in and what you're willing to endure. And I got very lucky in that I ended up in a career path that combines my passion for music with a policy focus and allows me to be an advocate on behalf of my friends and peers who are out there on the road every day. But I also made a conscious creative choice that I was like, if I was going to follow out, and I think this applies in performance as well. If I was not interested in doing the things that I would have needed to do to make it my full-time day job in recording. I didn't want to record the terrible funk rock band. I only want to work on records that I'm passionate about. And so I figured out a way that I could organize my life where I have a cool day job that's still involved with music that I love. And then I get to go have my creative life and work on stuff that I'm completely passionate about only.
Great, thank you. We have about 10 minutes left. Do anybody? Yes.
We've been talking a lot about situations in the United States, and a lot of the students of the Music Academy are not from the U.S. I would appreciate your thoughts on how different it might be, particularly with things like single-payer health insurance and other state subsidies for the arts in just about every other country. Put this one.
Corey?
Well, I got my worthless PhD in music composition in the United Kingdom, so I lived there almost 6 years. And governments matter. They really matter. In those days, there was national health. I don't know now. We have an English person sitting right
We still
here.
have national health, so we don't have the same kind of situation. We still have a national health. We're still in a position just about with our current government, which may change tomorrow, but we are still in a situation that, the government still pays a lot towards the arts. We don't have the same high rate of philanthropy that you have over here.
Yeah, I think this is an interesting aspect of the United States of America, is the tradition, the support for the arts. Phillippa and I were discussing something that for me was life-changing when I lived in the UK. It was BBC Radio. BBC Radio 3, their classical 24-hour channel, had several orchestras they employed. They produced brand new recordings in the studio and broadcast them. I actually had a couple things done that way. Unbelievable by our standards in this country. And of course, the irony is that in the UK, everyone looked at the Netherlands and said, oh, it's so much better in Holland. I'm going to move to Holland. And I was sitting here thinking, you have no idea how great it is right here. So, or I said, my accent was better in those days. So, yeah, I think the reality of where you are and how your country functions and how it values the arts is important. And the United States is a world center for incredibly great music education. Well, you know, we'll look at this place, case closed. You know, look where we are today. So it has that benefit. And you know, I'm not sure where that international calculus stops and ends. It's just kind of the reality. And the nice thing is that young, talented musicians can come to a place like this. That's enough for me. That's just great. Why would they work somewhere else when they can be at Music Academy of the West?
Do you want to use the mic for the stream?
I think that one of the things that just quickly, the ability to fail at something and not have it ruin your life, that's something that's different in other countries, I guess. Like,
just to follow up on the whole question of globalization, I think a lot of our sector over the last 50 years has been about globalization and artists moving freely. And what worries me, I don't know if any of you got the memo the other day about the London office, all suddenly shutting down O visas for artists coming in, basically saying that unless the officer who was looking at the application could identify the person coming through as a household name, that they were ineligible to come into the country, into the US to perform. And I think that as we look at a world that's starting to break up and re-isolate, I think we have another business model challenge on the horizon, which is about this whole free movement of artists.
Yeah, absolutely true. I mean, we will have a problem, I'm sure, in the UK because we all voted for Brexit, and you know, that will inevitably bring problems. It will mean that the UK-based people will have to have visas to go and perform in Europe. And certainly at Askonas Holt, I would say that 70% of the income that we earn through the company is in euros. With probably 20% in dollars and only 10% in UK pounds. So that will be a big problem, I think, getting visas, and it will become problematic. I mean, in fact, the UK people coming to work in America, as you know, is getting harder and harder and harder. You know, unless there's even with an emergency, you know, you cannot get a visa for, you know, you have to apply now 6 months in advance, and it is crazy. And also organizations, it's a very expensive business. Organizations don't want to pay for a visa now. And so then, you know, that is probably, we're looking at £1,500, £2,000 for an artist to come for a visa for one engagement, let's say, with the LA Phil or whoever it might be. You know, that starts to seriously take a chunk off your fee. Lady in green.
This is a little off the subject, but I would like to thank the three of you for being here very much. My daughter graduated last month from NYU Music Theater, and I've sat here the whole time and I've been texting her everything
saying
you
don't
all
do
have
it.
said because it's so very helpful. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
That's totally on point. That's fine.
Yeah.
and congratulations.
Questions like that are always welcome.
Thank you, and thanks so much. I'm a faculty member here in the summer of the Music Academy, and I've lived in Europe as a performing musician and have also served as an administrator, both in the US and at programs in Europe. And I just wanted to dial back to a couple of points with regards to how we make our careers and find our way as musicians and artists. And this is just a thought I wanted to put out there. And is there a way for us to kind of channel this idealism we have in the US within the scope of musical training to move from this all or nothing proposition that conservatories are struggling with as they're trying to both engage their students to become better and better artists, and whatever that means, and also the day-to-day realities of the marketplace, the world, and the numbers that the most gifted musicians are up against. So that's just one general idea I'd like to put out there, and think about how a lot of the work that I've done is encouraging and engaging students to rethink this in a positive and additive way rather than this either-or proposition. And it strikes me as pretty ironic in the US, where you're encouraged to fail and you're encouraged to try new things, yet at the same time there's this either-or kind of bifurcation within this music conservatory context and music university context. And then the second thing is that as musicians, as students of music, we're involved in the transmission and learning of some really deep history in terms of technique, interpretation, creativity. And we're working with mentors from a very early age, yet this whole idea of mentorship, both within music, but I think more importantly within the context of this conversation, outside music, and explicitly how to seek out mentors, how to interact with them, and to ask questions and to learn from other people having different experiences professionally, is something else that I think ought to be considered and thrown into the mix as we move forward. So these two things, really, mentorship, how to think about that actively as a younger musician who's emerging in the space, and think about it strategically as well. So, thanks.
You should be in the music business, because this is a good example of this kind of intersection between the arts and kind of like a business mentality that is one career option. I just want to put in a word for avoiding, what's the word I'm looking for? It's not lost opportunity, it's unfinished business. Okay, this is music, this is the arts. Someone who has talent is either going to give it everything they've got and answer the question, can I make this work for me? Or they're going to wind up regretting not trying. Because I'm assuming that the really great musicians, that we're actually talking about the really great musicians here. We haven't actually made that clear. We're talking about the obsessed, talented, maybe even genius musicians. That's who this conversation is for. It's too tough a business for anybody else to really, consider. Those people aren't going to really have a choice. They're going to be here. They're going to be at Juilliard. They're going to do it. And that's, to me, actually, in terms of like someone's life. I mean, we're talking about money. Okay, forget the word money. Let's talk about people's lives. If you're that gifted, you will do the thing of conservatory training, and you will present yourself to the world. And so I think your question is a really great one, because the question is, can someone who's really at that level, do they have any bandwidth left for a conversation about their career reality options? I don't know if they do. You guys are on the ground with these talented world-class students. I'm not every day. I don't know if they can take that, if you should offer it. Maybe you should. I'm actually sitting here thinking there's time. Pursue your craft. Don't be someone who later in life looks back and says, I should have pursued this. What if? That's the tragedy. So in a funny way, we don't want to get locked into that child prodigy, the latest, greatest 18-year-old pianist, genius thing. There's time. It's better to pursue the art, let the other pieces fall into place later.
I also like the framing of getting beyond the either-or questions. I think that like in terms of like what kinds of like flexible labor you're looking for on the side, and like how to find work that's meaningful and remunerative that helps you do your primary craft in a way that doesn't feel like a compromise, but that feels like a balanced life. That's an important conceptual framing to develop.
Just on the mentor thing, actually, excuse me, I would always encourage young artists, if I have young singers or young instrumentalists, conductors, I always encourage them to have a mentor, always. And actually, I normally encourage them to have a mentor that isn't in their field. Somebody who, generally in the arts, but a visual artist or a theatre director or an artistic director of an organization. I think, we work in a world where we don't just put on operas, and we don't just go and do chamber music concerts. You know, everybody has to be flexible and malleable about how they present their work. And I think it really broadens, certainly for a young artist, it really broadens their outlook if they are talking, you know, on a regular basis to people who are working, you know, in a connected but slightly different field.
Oh, real quick question in regards to your case study. Do you have the actual figures that go along with this so that you can...
The dollar amounts? Yeah, those were removed out of like privacy concerns, but I can we should talk some more.
Okay, that would be great, thanks.
While you're running around the room, I just want to say we haven't actually mentioned another way to earn revenue, a whole other side of the world of music and business, which is to be someone who writes music and creates music and is a composer. And everything we've talked about is only half the picture, okay? Almost every type of activity, if you happen to also be the composer, hired to conduct or to perform, there's an additional revenue side there. So not that we're short on composers, we're short on good composers, but I would encourage anyone who thinks they might be a composer and wants to make a living to let their composition side grow.
You were saying how important it is to have, to do a recording, to have an album done. How do I go about it if I never did it before as a young musician? Do I go after a label? Do I try to do it myself? How much that would cost for me?
Is that for me?
I mean, for any of you that...
Well, I'll start it off since I do this a lot. You know, it's so I think the point I was making is that in today's world, you don't have to wait for a record label to issue recordings and have them available on all of the platforms. So in terms of how you do that, you know, actually speaking of mentors, you might want to talk to someone who's already done it because there's so many innovative solutions. I'm not recommending this, but recording technology has gotten to the point where you don't necessarily need $1 million worth of equipment in a soundproof studio to make a, you know, pretty decent recording. And I know this is a horrible thing to hear from my friend from a record label, but that is kind of, you know, a little bit true right now. How you find that person, you know, I would ask to look at their current work. I would go online. I would look, you know, see who else has done a good, if you're a pianist, see who else has done a really good recording that you heard on Pandora or something. Maybe contact them and ask. The rights side of it, the legal side, I will just, without, you know, now expanding our session until 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, I would just tell you that if you're recording music that's protected by copyright, you know, that's like newer than Brahms, or whatever the cutoff is, newer than Debussy, you will need to make arrangements to pay the composer or their publisher, just as an observation, generally.
We have a bunch of resources on our website around digital distribution and breaking down how that works. Yeah.
Anybody else? I think we're done. Thank you very much. Thank you.